judgments. And thanks to you, sir, for playing the role of Krishna on Gita Jayanti. The cases referred by you will help the Arjuna, that is the taxpayer, to come out of the mess of the law. And we thanks to Someji for helping us for the slides. And at the end, sir, today is Gita Jayanti, and one shloka for you, sir. यद्यदाचरिति श्रेष्ठ तत्व देवे तरो जनः स यत्व प्रमाणम कुरुते लोक स्तद्न वर्तते। तृतीय अध्याय श्लोक 21। इस श्लोक का अर्थ है श्रेष्ठ पुरुष जो आचरण यानी जो काम करते हैं। तो श्रीधरन सर, जो आपने ये 40 साल से काम किया है सुप्रीम कोर्ट्स, हाई कोर्ट्स के जजमेंट्स के ऊपर, आपने जो प्रेजेंट किया है, दूसरे मनुष्य, आम इंसान वैसा ही आचरण करते हैं। सो वी ऑल चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट विल फॉलो यू, वैसा ही काम करते हैं। वह श्रेष्ठ पुरुष जो प्रमाण या उदाहरण प्रस्तुत करता है, समस्त मानव समुदाय उसी का अनुकरण करने लगते हैं। सो वी ऑल जीएसटी प्रैक्टिशनर्स follow you, and we are there that Somesh will also in future we will also listen to you, Somesh ji. And thanks to all the participants for sparing that valuable times. Over to you, Manish sir.
Thank you.
Over to you, Preeti madam.
Yeah. So our next session immediately we will start. Thank you very much, Sridharan sir. Thank you, Umesh bhai, and thank you, Somesh, for the wonderful session. And now over to next session is on best practices evolved in carrying investigations and forensic. And we have very learned speaker, CA Vidya Rajarao with us, and our beloved Central Council member, CA NC Hegdeji, along with our senior regional council member, CA Sushrit Chitre, and our youngest regional council member, CA Arpit Kabra, on the dais. And I request NC Hegde sir to please give the welcome note for the session.
Thank you.
So thank you, Preeti, and I think good evening, colleagues. It is always great to, of course, see Mr. Sridharan, and I think it is very befitting that this was on the Bhagavad Gita Jayanti, because he's been a true Karma Yogi. I mean, I've seen him for so many years. And Mr.
Hello,
Sridharan.
NC Hegde sir.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So, sir, thank you. I only got some last snippets of your slide because I came in just now. But it is always a pleasure and a treat to, sir, hear you. And also, more than that, your passion in helping and, spreading the knowledge, actually, I think that is even more laudatory, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Colleagues and friends, I think now we move on to another very important topic, as Preeti mentioned, and which is in relation to investigations and forensic and the scope of these particular area now, because this has become extremely important in the current context, as you know, with an auditor's duty to report fraud, as well as internal auditor also being required to look at controls, which actually are most important in relation to any fraud assignment. I think it is the scope of these particular areas has increased exponentially in recent times. So I think here, given that we have an excellent speaker, I'm not going to really deal too much with the subject, but with this thought that it is extremely important for us while performing the statutory auditor role, obviously, to ensure that internal controls are taken care of. We do our risk assessments, we do our diligences to the extent possible. So that is one aspect of this entire, I think, the entire subject that we are going to discuss today. But also forensic and investigation and risk assessments have become extremely important as an area of practice for chartered accountants as well. And I think that is an area that we should really take note of. It is increasing because risk assessments, health checks, etc., become very important for any person, any investor coming into an organization to see how internal controls are and controls and processes and the risk framework is. And again, once there is a fraud detected, then obviously there is an external firm of chartered accountants, which is normally actually hired in order to look at the fraud. And that is where the area of forensic practice is growing very, very rapidly. So both investigation as well as forensic risk assessment and fraud have become very, very important areas of practice now. I think this is again going to rise or skyrocket, because if you look at the present situation and the future of work, if you saw that in the pandemic, in the last 1 year, we've all been working from home, and most people are, they have most fertile imaginations when they work from home because they have a lot of time to spare, right? So I'm sure that in the coming future, we will see a lot of cyber frauds. We will see a lot of, already there have been a couple of banks which have been a target of attacks. And as you have seen, even a lot of government sites have been, tried to be hacked and things like that. So with the new era of work, with the future of work being all work from anywhere, it is going to move from work from home to work from anywhere. Systems will have to be very robust. And I think this will, of course, provide for greater opportunities for chartered accountants to look at this particular area, both the risk assessment frameworks, that is in order to be to devise systems for preventive, and then to get into the investigative mode and to develop a strong forensic practice. I'll stop here because we have an expert, and I think a little learning is a very dangerous thing. I have only very little knowledge in this area, so I will hand it over back to my colleagues in the Western India Regional Council, who will introduce our expert speaker, and I will do the better thing of listening to her.
Thank you, NC Hegde sir, for your words of wisdom and raising this occasion on the regional conference for this station. As the name suggests, Vidya, we all are gathered over here to upgrade our Vidya, and I request Arpit Kabra to introduce Vidya madam.
Thank you, Preeti madam. Respected Sridhan sir, it's always a delight to hear you, sir, and thank you for your time today. And Central Council member NC Hegde sir, it's a opportunity. It's a fantastic opportunity today to interact with all of you in this regional conference. And today, by the sheer amount of opportunity that brings in this forensic audit, this topic is now part of regional conference also. I'm very glad to see that. As sir mentioned, people are fertile when they are at home, and so many frauds are erupting. So I think Vidya madam brings in a lot of expertise to deal with such kind of frauds. Recently you've heard about Homeland Security, US Homeland Security also being subject to a cyber attack. So I think forensic audit will become very critical and will be a very important part for all of us as chartered accountants. And the first part to do is stop calling it as forensic audit, because it is never an audit, it is forensic investigation. As rightly mentioned, we'll have to stop being an auditor to be a forensic investigator. So today I invite all of you to, along with Vidya madam, who will be guiding us, because she is the one who set up and established the forensic services practice at Grant Thornton and PwC in India. She has over 25 years of experience and expertise in numerous forensic accounting assignments, fraud investigations, regulatory proceedings in India and the US that require reconstruction of complex financial records. Please mark this very, very carefully, that this is what our roles would require us to be. Reconstruct the financial records, electronic data, and large data sets of accounting transaction and documents. She's also known for her expertise in determining damages and providing expert testimony in large international and domestic arbitration matters. She's a chartered accountant, and she's also a certified fraud examiner from the US, the world's largest anti-fraud organization. She was the first Indian to be elected to the board of regents of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and she recently served as the vice chair of ACFE's board of regents. She's currently the founder and director of Opedia Private Limited, a startup venture that aims to equip young professionals in accounting, law, and manage stakeholders like independent directors, executive directors, and company secretaries, largely to combat fraud, mitigate fraud risk, build repository of fraud schemes and scenarios with special emphasis on cultural attributes of fraud in India. Madam, we would love to hear more on this part, because this is something that is so critical for our economy, India overall, the cultural attributes of fraud in India. She's also currently the chair of Audit Committee and Independent Director at a fast-growing global engineering organization headquartered in Pune. She is also nominated recently as a member of the Technical Advisory Committee of the NFRA, which is a regulatory body again. So, you know, with such a profound profile we've had with us, we welcome you, Vidya Madam, to this regional conference, and we request you to please contemplate on the various measures and the various initiatives in fraud forensic investigation that a chartered accountant should take care of. Thank you, Madam. Over to you, Preeti Madam.
Thank you very much, Arpit. It seems your by heart is a profile, such a big profile, and nicely given. So, Vidya Madam, over to you. We are eagerly waiting to hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Very honored and humbled to have been invited to this August gathering of chartered accountants. I think all of you know a lot more about accounting and auditing in India than I can ever learn. So I'm hoping this will be a journey which you'll accompany me on for about 45 minutes. And I've kept enough time for questions because I think maybe all of you will have a lot more questions. So let me just start. I think like it says best practices in carrying out investigations and forensics. So you can go to the next slide. So I'll cover the following areas. Just give you a simple overview and go right into when does a forensic investigation get initiated, what are some of the investigation methodologies, and a very critical aspect on investigation report, and a summary of some very quick fundamentals which hopefully you can take away. And this is meant to be a very practical session, so you can apply this knowledge immediately in your practice when you currently, if you're doing an investigation or you come across an investigation tomorrow or you're engaged to do an investigation tomorrow. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah. So when does an investigation get initiated? So typically the trigger events for an investigation are an employee or whistleblower complaints. So these companies are required, large companies have their own whistleblower hotline, like a third-party whistleblower hotline, and there are lots of complaints in the hotline which then will have to be investigated. There are also a complaint sometimes by a third party, like a vendor, a customer, a supplier, shareholder. So those again can trigger an investigation. There are findings from internal audit or external audit. So they may have an indicia of fraud, which will then have to be investigated by a specialized team. There'll be regulatory enforcement activities, whether it is the SEBI or SFIO or MCA, CBI, state government agencies, ED. So that will also require, sometimes you even see Competition Commission, which will have a requirement, even tax authorities. There are allegations of financial misconduct, which either come through the hotline or, you know, sometimes they're just hallway conversations. There could be a search warrant, a government subpoena. Sometimes there are workplace safety issues, misconduct, and other times it's a voluntary legal duty, including a failure on compliance with the Companies Act or undue media attention, where the company board, especially independent directors on the board, would want to conduct an investigation, because ultimately it's about fact finding. So in one simple phrase, if I could say what's investigation, it's all about fact finding. So find the truth so you know where you stand, so you can then deal with any questions or repercussions since you now have the right facts on hand. Next. So if you look at the investigation methodologies, it's very different from what you would normally see in an audit, whether it's internal or external. So in the investigation methodologies, we typically have 4 key steps: transaction analysis, which includes forensic accounting and forensic data analytics, digital forensics, intelligence, and interview. So each of these lead to specific evidences. Obviously, the analysis of forensic accounting data and analytics and digital forensics will give you conclusive evidence, because you will have documentary proof of either a transaction being recorded incorrectly or not recorded, or accounts having been misrepresented. The intelligence and interview will give you persuasive evidence, which are more circumstantial testimonies, which you can further use to corroborate your physical and documentary evidence. So we'll now go into each of these investigation methodologies in more detail. Next. So forensic accounting. So the first aspect, the first step should really be to speak to the whistleblower. If you have a whistleblower complaint, it's almost impossible to carry out an investigation if you do not understand what the concerns and the issues of the whistleblower are. Because remember, the whistleblower has already seen how these issues have been operating in the company. They've seen how the transactions have been misrecorded. They will know, for example, which sales invoices are fictitious or fake, which entries are fake. So they all, or maybe they've been Can you go back to 3.1? I'm still there. Yeah, thank you. So the first step is to have a discussion with the whistleblower. That may be easier said than done because some whistleblowers are very reluctant. Obviously, they remain anonymous. Confidentiality is critical and anonymity is critical. That's protected under law. So it is a challenging situation to speak to the whistleblower, but there are ways in which you can talk to the whistleblower, and the whistleblower also is very keen to talk to a forensic investigator. The whistleblower typically does not want to talk to someone inside the company because they don't trust someone in the company. They fear retaliation, retribution, they fear for their life sometimes. So one of the best practices is to engage in a direct communication with the whistleblower. I have done that where I separately email or call the whistleblower, or just email if it's anonymous, and they will respond back. It takes a little persuasion, but you have to reassure them that you are there to find the facts of the investigation. You are there to find out the what, not the who, because many times the investigation gets focused on who did this, or who is the whistleblower and who has done these acts. That's not relevant. What is relevant is what has occurred in the company, what malpractices, what fraudulent transactions, what is more important than who has perpetrated it. So if you reassure the whistleblower, even if it's an anonymous email, will respond back to the investigator, and you then have an open line of communication to understand his or her concerns. And based on those concerns, and this has to be a one-on-one discussion, so you cannot involve anyone in the company. So you need to build that trust with the whistleblower. And then you validate and confirm the hypothesis which the whistleblower has indicated, whether it is false accounting, whether it is expense statement fraud, whether it is unauthorized scrap sales, related party transactions, could be inappropriate money transfers, misuse of company property. It can run the entire scheme, but if the whistleblower has witnessed this in person, they will usually have some evidence with them or some indication of where these transactions could occur and what are the indicators of these transactions. So you validate and confirm this hypothesis first based on certain test check or samples. You will also get a sense of whether it is at a particular division, plant, or subsidiary, or whether it's at the corporate office. Is it occurring during consolidation? Is it at the branch accounting level? Is it in a subsidiary ledger? Where are the evidences located and who are the players? Does it reach the level of management? Is the CEO involved? Is the CFO involved? Is it the head of the plant? Is it the head of operations, head of sales? So you will also get a sense of who the people are in the alleged fraud scheme, because remember, it is still alleged till you prove and gather facts. So who are involved in this alleged fraud and what is their sphere of influence? So you will then be able to assess how pervasive this fraud scheme is based on time. You will be able to know the implication. So obviously, as accountants, we all know that if the CEO and the CFO, the C-suite influence is far greater, and their sphere of influence and their ability to circumvent controls is far greater than someone who is a clerk who's got only simple rights to approve checks, for example. So you can then you're then able to plan your investigation much better and be very clear, and also anticipate the roadblocks which are likely to come based on the whistleblower's complaints, and you'll get an appreciation for the whistleblower's own concerns about their own safety or of their job or life. So you also have to review multiple evidences, so not look at just one evidence. So you have to go beyond what you would normally gather as an audit evidence, typical audit evidences. So you will have to look at personnel files, so non-financial data, for example, like HR records. In addition to accounting records like ledgers, you have to look at forms, returns, confirmations, etc. And you rely upon only factual information and authenticate your evidence, because you will, in the initial stages, you will hear a lot of contrary statements. So these will be, for lack of a better word, just conversations, discussions, statements. So you will need to evaluate which of these statements are correct based on a sample validation. And many times they'll be contrary to each other. So you will need to be very clear in taking the statements at face value without attributing any bias or intention, and then rely on the data to speak for itself. Look for inappropriate supporting documentation. So documents are overwritten, there are photocopies. Many times I find that the company does not have original, in an electronic situation, it's difficult to evaluate what is original and what is not an original. So that will require some skill. Sometimes signatures are forged. The company has conflicting evidence. There are two contracts, one which is signed, one which is not signed. The signed one is purported to be falsely signed or forged. So you will have to be very careful in terms of documentation that you're reviewing, and especially be careful about photocopies. Absence of supporting documents. Many times the company does not have supporting documents. It's unusual, even though we all know as accountants that the company has a requirement to maintain documents, but sometimes they're not available. It is a significant red flag, or sometimes it takes days to gather a supporting documentation, which should, in your own experience, should be readily available or available within 1 to 2 days, a reasonable time frame. You'll have to also assess instances of unauthorized retrievals, or someone may have destroyed documents, or they're lost and the company has no control over it. And how is the maintenance of documents? Unnecessarily complicated systems, again, is a significant red flag, because some companies have undue complexity which just does not fit with their business profile and the way they do business. And you have to vouch critical data points or evaluate critical data points such as address, email, telephone, PAN, GST, any other government specified registration, etc., unauthorized use of company seal and stamps. So these are some initial forensic accounting steps that you can undertake to validate the concerns of the whistleblower. And once those are confirmed, you then expand to certain parameters once you know whether it is affected. If it's a revenue recognition issue, for example, then you will look at you will have to then evaluate whether you go back one financial year, is it multiple financial years, multiple quarters? Did it start with the new CFO perhaps who came in, or was it because the old CFO retired? So you'll have to evaluate the circumstances and accordingly decide the time period of your review. And also look at, if it is an allegation is at the C-suite, you'll also look at beyond revenue. Remember, the sphere of influence is quite significant at that level. Could there have been other accounts which also could have been falsified? For example, understating expenses or provisions and reserves. So you'll have to be open to those possibilities, but those can follow once you have confirmed the initial allegation of, say, cooking the books or managing earnings for specific quarters. So you then can look at other areas which the person likely has a sphere of influence. Next. No, forward, yeah. So forensic data analytics is again very critical because all accounting ledgers are now electronic. You know, when I started, it was paper ledgers. To some extent, I think they were simpler, but they had their own challenges. But now all accounting ledger is electronic. So it's very critical that the investigator, the investigating team, extracts the data dump. So you will have to do a basic hygiene check to evaluate what is the data universe, you know, what control environment or what IT systems are they working on. So if they're working on SAP, they're working on Tally, they may be working on Oracle, they may have some other custom in-house system. So you will need someone in your team who's well versed with accounting, IT accounting and general ledger accounting systems to evaluate first what is the data universe, because it's very critical that you understand what is the data universe as far as accounting is concerned at the company. So the company may have multiple books of accounts, and if you land up not, you know, if you're not aware or open to that possibility and you only look at one set of accounts because you've logged in as one person and you only have access to one particular company account, you're missing an entire picture. Also, collection of data. The investigator must collect data on their own. They cannot delegate that data collection to the company, because many times I have seen that if you ask a company to give you data, they will give you reports, because remember, the accounting team will only have authority to generate reports, because as users in their own company, they will only be able to click on a button and it will generate a report. And that report is meant for normal financial reporting purposes. It's not meant for the purpose of an investigation. And if the allegation is that there was earnings management, then any report you get is already contains the effect of those earnings management. So that's not helpful. So you need data, you do not need reports. So you also need to validate whether the data that you are retrieving. So again, you'll need your own IT team to take a data dump. Essentially, you dump your entire accounting system into your company server, into your firm's server, or you can host it somewhere. So you'll need that capability to extract data of millions of records if it is multiple financial years or even one financial year based on the size of the company. So you will need to extract the data, do a simple data collection and a data validation. So if you generate, if you take the data from the company and if you generate a trial balance, does the trial balance agree? I have seen many times that the trial balance does not agree from the data that I have extracted. Of course, when the company gives me the trial balance, it obviously matches, and their data, the trial balance agrees to the financials. But the data when I extract does not, the trial balance does not agree. So you have to do a basic hygiene check and then apply the concept of fraud triangle to data analytics. So the fraud triangle is a very simple tool, but a very powerful tool. So the fraud triangle is essentially, it was coined, I think, in 1953 or 73, if I remember correctly, if my memory serves me right, by an American psychologist called Donald Cressy. And he talked about the psychology of why people commit fraud. And he identified at least 3 characteristics that enable people to commit fraud. The first one, you would have heard of this, it's very common, incentive or pressure. So where there's an incentive to meet a specific target, whether it's earnings, sales, you have certain sales targets, you have to meet certain customer orders. So you have a target because based on that target, you get an incentive. You know, your commission increases by 5% if you cross a threshold, or your bonus increases if you cross a certain target. Or there is a pressure because there's a pressure from CEO, CFO, head of accounting, or pressure from industry, pressure from external analysts that your competitors in the industry are doing better. So you have a pressure to meet certain EBITDA targets or profit targets, sales targets. The next aspect of the triangle is opportunity. So the opportunity is essentially the ability to misuse controls or to take advantage of existing controls in an organization and perpetrate fraud. The third angle is rationalization, or as human beings, we need a rationalization component to why we are committing fraud. And the rationalization manifests itself commonly as everybody else is doing it. And you see that it's very common in bribery and corruption schemes. You feel, well, everyone is taking a bribe, so it cannot be wrong if 90 out of 100 are doing it, or 99 out of 100 are doing the same thing as me, right? Or the rationalization also manifests itself as I'm only taking what is due to me. You know, I was promised a bonus of X rupees. The company did not give me that bonus. They gave me a lesser amount. So I'm only taking what was due to me. So I'm not, you know, it's not wrong. So I'm able to rationalize stealing money from the company because anyway, I was supposed to get a bonus. Or the other way the rationalization manifests itself is I will put it back. I'm only borrowing. You know, I have a immediate urgency. There is a medical requirement in the family, or there's a requirement for expenses due to a marriage or schooling or some unexpected issues. So I'll borrow from the company. I'm essentially stealing, but I intend to put it back. So I'm going to return it to the company. So how can it be theft if I'm going to return it? It's only a timing issue. So I'm able to rationalize. So these three factors, the incentives or pressure, the opportunity, and the rationalization, this concept can be used in data analytics. So when you extract data, even in keyword searches, which I'll cover, you can use this concept to determine what could be the likely motivation. And there are several research papers which indicate that as compared to Western advanced economies, and if you look at developing emerging economies like India, the opportunity component of the triangle is far greater in emerging economies, and especially in India, there's research specific to India, than the other two components of the triangle. Whereas in Western countries, the incentive or pressure plays a much greater role than opportunity. So what does that mean for an investigator in India? So the opportunity aspect, as I indicated earlier, goes back to controls. So how strong are your controls, or rather how weak are your controls? What are the loopholes in your controls which is enabling someone either within the company or outside or jointly to take advantage of these weaknesses? So you then will have to focus on what controls, what are the quality of the controls, the strength of the controls, especially with respect to fraud risk, not with respect to financial controls, operation controls, because many of you as internal auditors would be testing controls, but maybe not necessarily keeping an angle on fraud. Or you look at internal controls over financial reporting, the ICOFAR reviews. Again, those go towards financial statements. So you'll have to incorporate an element of fraud risk in those controls and test how effective are those controls in preventing fraud. If they can't prevent it, can they detect it? Then what's the time lag in detection after the fraud has occurred? If they neither prevent nor detect, what is the utility of that fraud? And are they automated or are they manual? So you'll have to apply this concept of fraud triangle and of course assess the accounting entries in terms of unreconciled balances, contra entries, suspense accounts, incomplete entries, single-sided entries, top-side entries, related party transactions, various personal transactions, etc. The other critical aspect is also to look at data interrelationships. So many times as accountants, we only rely on financial data. But as an investigator, you'll have to look at non-financial data and also look at unstructured data. So what do I mean by non-financial data? So you look at HR data, you look at data which is sitting in the legal counsel's office. You look at data which is in operations. You look at data which is, in qualitative metrics of vendor performance, for example. You look at performance reviews of employees. So these are not financial data. You look at vendor onboarding forms, because that's not financial data again. So you'll have to look at and evaluate whether two different sets of data are telling the same story, or if there is a difference and variance. And you also look at time chart analysis, where you plot the alleged incident, the date and time, and what led to these irregularities, along with all of the other analysis that you've done, both accounting and analytics. Next. The second methodology or critical step is defense. So here you will look at systems, hard drive, memory devices, mobile phones, laptops, desktops, servers, CCTV footages, sometimes smartwatches, and you'll get a whole variety of evidences, from logs to emails. You could have a draft invoice, voucher. You can have draft checks, so you can have invoices of vendors in editable format, various internet activities, and sometimes they may have some specialized software to erase their own information, etc. But all of these, it's very critical. The most important aspect here is to ensure that the assets which are subject to a forensic process are owned by the company. It should be very clearly documented that the asset is owned by the company, because under the privacy regulations, one cannot take personal devices of employees as part of digital forensics unless those assets are owned by the company. And the company's asset usage policy must be very clearly documented. Nowadays, I see a lot of companies, especially IT companies, have very clear contract clauses even in the employment. So as soon as the employee is onboarded in the employment contract, there's a contract which is sent in addition to just a onboarding letter. So it's a fairly large contract or a letter which the employee has to sign, which indicates which assets are owned by the company and the policies of the company as far as use of those assets is concerned, and the employee's obligation to turn over their assets if and when an investigation is required for whatever reason determined by the company. And the employee also has to sign a declaration that they will not use the asset for inappropriate purposes. They will cooperate in the investigation, and any non-cooperation would be treated as immediate dismissal. So these clauses have come into picture, and employment agreements now have become very strict. And I've seen, especially at IT companies, because there's a lot of intellectual property theft and loss of confidentiality, leakage of confidentiality, and data compromise. So I'm seeing these clauses more often. So it has to be very clear that the assets are owned by the company. Otherwise, you may not be able to perform any forensic assessment of that asset. Second, the very clear aspect is document a very clear chain of custody. So you need to be very clear who used the device last. And when it's handed over to you as in the investigating team, who is the person from the investigating team who's taking the chain of custody. You need to document the condition of the asset, either photograph where it was located, including all the other components. Did it have a pen drive? Did it have a printer jack? Was it connected by Bluetooth? What are all the other connections? Was it connected to a hard drive, or was it just a laptop with a monitor? Whether there were any encryption, and you will need to get the permission of, obviously, you will do it in the chain of custody, permission of the client who's appointing you. So you need to have a proper authorization letter from the board or the CEO or whoever is engaged you to do the investigation, that you have the authority to take a company asset and for this limited purpose. So it's very clear that you document this clear chain of custody. This is very critical, because if if the evidence has to be admitted in a court of law, at a later date, the question will always come as to how do we know that this particular evidence which you have retrieved from a particular device has not been planted, right? So the employee will always sometimes will say that it's not an email that they sent, right? So when they handed over the device, the email did not exist. The email was later planted by the company, the investigator, someone else. So you will need to be very clear to say that you need to have your chain of custody very clearly documented with all the electronic trail to show that the email was not planted. This email existed. It existed at this specific date. It was written by this person. It was sent to these people. It predated because of these various factors, and it's been validated that this has not been planted post facto after taking control of the device. Next. Yeah, so on digital forensics again, so you'll have to, like I said, evaluate the hierarchy, have the specific logs, when was the last log taken. Sometimes we've seen, especially if it is someone who's very savvy in IT, they would have disabled the logs. So you will not know the last 5, transactions or the last 5 actions they did on their computer because they've disabled the logs. That in itself is a significant red flag, because normally it will have to be someone who knows what they're doing is not right and does not want a trace in order to disable the logs. Sometimes they would have manipulated the system date and time. That's why you see many companies now, when they issue laptops, individual employees cannot change the system date or time. So you will no longer have access or permission to change your system date or time. We've seen it before that the employee has changed the system date or time and then recorded the entry. Sometimes emails, again, they manipulate the system date and time. So all those now, obviously with advanced technology, you can ensure that those controls are in place so that employees do not have the ability to manipulate control settings. Preparing a list of keywords, which you then can search. Again, you can use the fraud triangle in terms of opportunity, incentive or pressure or rationalization. Develop the keywords in sync with the fraud triangle. Evaluate the number of search hits. So once you run the search, on emails, do you want to run it on emails and folders, emails and attachments, deleted files, you'll then have to recover deleted files, on pictures, images. So it's a fairly lengthy process which you'll have to undertake in terms of what's the universe on which you want to run the keyword. And then once you have the hits, you then will have to do 100% review. You cannot do a sample check. It's almost like a funnel where you come up with, say, hits of 10,000, and you'll have to review and keep eliminating a lot of false positives to arrive at the 2 or 3 key emails that are specific to the allegation in question. You'll have to look at assessment of emails which are BCC'd, or emails which are shared outside the company domain, or emails which are forwarded, documents which are forwarded to private email addresses, so the personal email of the employee, or it's a competitor vendor. Based on your allegation, we've seen cases where the employee just before leaving or resigning will send a whole bunch of emails with attachments, say sales price list or customer data or software code or a product launch or strategy, a very critical information to the company. They will send it to their own email, or they will use a internet facility, many of you may know, called Dropbox, drop this onto a cloud, which they can then later use. This may violate their employment agreement and may be a cause for action against the employee, especially if the employee is going to a competitor, or 1 week later, 2 months later, they set up a competing agency to compete with the same work that you were doing in your company. So you'll have to look at that, all of that information, and look at, again, printing. If they're again, many of them have printing logs, so you can see what documents are printed. If not electronic, maybe they've taken hard copy. Sometimes we've seen in investigations templates of a vendor invoice, which is editable, which is unusual. So you should not be finding a vendor invoice in an editable format with the signatures, etc., or company seal of other companies in the employee's device. Document properties, when was the document created, modified, etc., and backups and all of that. I think one question which I frequently get asked is, what about personal information? So many of us use company laptops for storing our own personal data. The line between personal and business is really blurred. And we tend to do a lot of our office work at home and home work at office. So some of you may be in the habit of saving your bank statements, your personal bank statements, your personal accounts, maybe your personal credit card statements, because you're logging in at work and paying your credit card. You're anyway at work 10, 12 hours a day, so you just log in and pay your credit card, but you want to know the balance, so you save it or you download it, and you've saved it on a folder and you say personal. There may be other personal files, where you're planning a vacation, your family's personal details, your son's education, maybe a loan you've taken, could be a whole host of, medical files, which are all very personal to you. So there are questions in terms of, can those be used as evidence, right? Because it's on a company asset. Some legal opinion is that I've had legal opinion, it's best to get a legal opinion in those cases because the asset is the company's, the employee has given the device. Are you going to use those personal details or not? So it's best to get a legal opinion. Some, I've had two different opinions, so that's why I'm saying it's best to get a legal opinion. In one case, we were advised that yes, you can use it. Because the bank statements were quite useful in that case, because there were a lot of cash deposits which were which very neatly fit into a timeline of a vendor kickback scheme. So that was evidence which was very helpful, which we can then use it to interview the subject and confront the subject with this evidence. In other cases, you may not be able to use it. So it's always best to get the legal opinion in terms of, can you use personal data of the employee, because the employee always has rights over his personal data, even if it is on the company laptop, and what is the extent of privacy the employee can expect varies, and it's a matter of law and not for us investigators to decide. Go to the next slide.
We have a session next, and we can complete in next 5 minutes.
Yes, sure. So I'll skim through these. Intelligence gathering, again, you will need specialized third parties to do this. So let me just then go straight to the last slide, which is, I think, yeah, I think you can just go to the fundamentals. Yeah, the last slide, which is fundamentals. Yeah, so I'll just cover with, yeah, that's fine. The top 10 list, so to speak. So the investigation is not internal audit or external audit. So we have to get away from this view that it's a forensic audit, like Arpit mentioned earlier. There's no such thing as a forensic audit. I know everybody calls it as a forensic audit. An audit is a completely different requirement under law. Investigation and forensics is a completely different requirement. So the methodologies also used for investigations are very different, and the methodology you use to investigate cannot be fraudulent. I think there are a lot of ways in which as chartered accountants, we gather data, but sometimes it is not legal. For example, and it's very frequently available in the market. Just because it's available, that does not make it right. Because if there is a case which goes to court, a chartered accountant can be hauled up for getting data which is not proper. For example, getting my bank statement without my consent, or going through my personal files, or going through my garbage, or interrogating my son or daughter about what I do during the day. If they're below 18, they're not adults, so they're children. So there are rules around what you can do, and there are boundaries of collecting evidences. In case of incapacity, so if you don't have the capacity, especially intelligence or forensic imaging and forensic analytics, best to hire a third party, but you have to make sure that the third party is competent. So you cannot say that the third party made a mistake, because ultimately it is still the investigator's report. You have to be objective. Investigation is to establish a fact. So it's fact finding, so you must be objective, uphold the principle of integrity, confidentiality, and independence. These are all principles we are aware of as chartered accountants, and we must maintain these principles even during an investigation. We should know our legal limits. Again, I see many cases where there is an outreach, there's an overreach of the investigation. So for example, government investigators have different sets of powers. They have the power of a subpoena, they have the power of the government behind them. As a private investigator, my remit only comes from the mandate given by my client. So I cannot overreach that limit. I have to maintain proper, thorough documentation, including an engagement letter, non-disclosure agreements. The report I write must stand the test of law. That's critical. So I need to have a report which is properly prepared. It's not an audit report where the language is specified in a statute. It's an investigator's report, is almost a free-flowing report. You can design the report the way you want and will reflect on you as an investigator, but it should withstand the test of law. Remember, establishing intention is key, and if you follow the fraud triangle, use the fraud triangle both in your methodology and conclusion, you'll be able to write a fairly good report which will withstand the test of law. So I think let me stop with that and see if anyone has any questions. My apologies, I overshot the time. I thought I had 45 minutes.
No, I think, Madam, you started at...
Madam, you have taken, in this shortest possible time, you have taken, gone through in much detail, and it was with the top 10 fundamentals. It was excellent session, and